Andrew Yang's name is popping up more and more often. Universal basic income and a value-added tax are among the policies he's proposing, and they seem to resonate with a large segment of the American people. But is Yang proposing a new solution that can solve America's ills? Or is he as economically illiterate as every other politician who thought they could allocate resources better than the free market? Stay tuned to find out. Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents. I've already talked about Universal Basic Income, or UBI, quite a bit on this channel, and so I wasn't initially planning on talking about Andrew Yang. However, enough viewers have brought Yang to my attention such that I realized his policy proposals do need to be addressed. In this video, I'll be reviewing comments that Yang made on the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast. Let's jump right into it.
I've been driven to universal basic income in part because I've been looking at the numbers. The 5 most common jobs in the United States right now are administrative and clerical work, retail and sales, food service and food prep, truck driving and transportation and manufacturing. Those 5 jobs comprise about half of all American jobs. Only 32% of Americans graduate from college. So the average American's a high school grad doing one of these 5 jobs. And if you look at it, technology is already doing a number on each of these jobs. Like the first, administrative and clerical, includes call center workers, and AI is in the process of taking over that job. Retail and sales, 30% of malls are closing in the next 4 years. So the danger here is to think of it as artificial intelligence is coming. It's actually already eating up the most common jobs in our economy, and it's driving Americans into distress in various ways in the numbers.
Okay, well, let's go back in time to the year 1900 or so. In the year 1900, according to Ancestry.com, the 5 most common jobs in America were farmer, servant, general laborer, clerk, and industrial worker. Examples of the last one being bricklayers, railroad workers, or factory workers. According to the best data available from the U.S. Census Bureau, the percentage of the population working as farmers in the year 1850 was about 64%. But today it's only 1%, if not less. How many of the people in 1900 owned automobiles, much less knew that truck driver would one day become one of the 5 most common occupations? This is another example of the Luddite fallacy, or the belief that new technology leads to greater unemployment. Every time in history someone has claimed this, no such unemployment occurred. Instead, new jobs emerged as people found new ways to utilize the time and resources that had been freed up by the increased efficiency from the new technology. Now, I know someone will say, but, there's never been AI before this. To which I say, so what? Who had heard of an 18-wheeler before 1900? Who had heard of the internet before 1990? Who in 1900 could have dreamed of all the professions that exist in 2019? If and when we reach the point where robots literally do everything, the point will be moot since no one will have to work. But until then, I see no reason to think that the irrelevance of older jobs will stop new jobs from being created. Not one time in history has this been proved to be true. So what makes you think that this time is the time that technology will finally leave the majority of the population unemployed and destitute?
Now, when you're talking about universal basic income, there's 2 questions that come up. How much money and where is it coming from?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that if you look at the heritage of universal basic income, it's a deeply American idea where Thomas Paine was for it at the founding of the country. And then Martin Luther King was for it. Milton Friedman, the godfather of conservative economists, was for it. And one state has had it in effect for 37 years, where everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked.
That's Alaska?
Yeah, it's Alaska, and they fund it with oil money.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm going around telling people is that technology is the oil of the 21st century.
Okay, let's be clear on something. Milton Friedman proposed a negative income tax, which is not quite the same as universal basic income. But besides that, he did not think that the redistribution of wealth was inherently a good thing. He believed a negative income tax would be less wasteful than the current welfare bureaucracy, and in that regard, comparing a negative income tax to the current welfare system renders a negative income tax the lesser of 2 evils. I am inclined to agree with Friedman's assessment on this point, But saying that something is the lesser of two evils is not the same as saying something is inherently good and ought to be embraced, even if there are other options available. As for Yang citing Alaska as a successful example of UBI, it's important to note that in Alaska, each resident receives between $1,000 and $2,000 annually, not monthly. That comes out to, at best, $167 per month. Hardly enough for a person to live on. So I have to ask Mr. Yang what he thinks the purpose of the UBI is. If he thinks it's to give people on the poorer end of the spectrum just a little extra cash, then it's not hard to see that the smaller the UBI payment, the more likely a UBI program is to be sustainable in the long term. However, if the purpose of UBI is to guarantee that every American has enough to live on whether they work or not, then how is Alaska an example of a UBI success? I'll leave a link to an article on this video's corresponding blog post from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton that discusses Alaska's dividend program for those who would like to learn more.
So I know you spoke to another guest about, hey, how do you get, let's say, approximately $3 trillion a year to fund universal basic income? And the great thing is that the first thing is it's not actually $3 trillion. And the reason why it's not $3 trillion is that if you look at what we're currently doing, we're spending about $1.5 trillion right now on 126 welfare programs and Social Security. And so if you show up to someone's door and say, hey, here's a dividend of $1,000 a month, but if you're already getting more than $1,000 in stuff, we're not just going to stack it on top. We're just going to say you're guaranteed $1,000, and if you're already getting more, then this doesn't touch you. You can keep your current stuff. If you're getting $700 in food stamps and whatnot, then you can just get $300 on top. So the $3 trillion actually shrinks a lot very fast because of the fact that about half of Americans are already getting various income support from the government. So the real price tag is closer to about $1.8 trillion if you say everyone who's 18 and up.
So Yang is not saying scrap all existing welfare programs and replace them with a UBI, as would have been more along the lines of what Milton Friedman proposed. He's saying keep existing welfare programs, and then on top of that, make sure that every American is getting $1,000 a month from the government no matter what. This means that the personnel the government employs to manage current welfare programs don't go away, but also that additional government employees will be needed to manage Yang's program and to make sure that Americans who already receive $1,000 or more from the government aren't getting an extra $1,000. Remember, the money needed to fund welfare or UBI programs of any kind doesn't just include the money that will go into the hands of the citizens, but also the money required to cover the administrative costs that the government inevitably incurs in managing such programs. By his own admission, Yang admits that whether it's $3 trillion or $1.8 trillion, his proposal will increase government spending when the debt is already $22 trillion. So what is his plan exactly?
Now, for context, the entire U.S. economy is now $20 trillion, up $5 trillion in the last 12 years, and the federal budget's $4 trillion.
And by Hauser's law, the most the government can possibly hope to collect is 20% of GDP. So best case scenario, the current federal budget spends every penny it takes in. Assuming, of course, that it actually collects the full 20% of the $20 trillion GDP.
So you're looking at $1.8 trillion. It's a lot of money. But it's actually manageable. And one of the things that I haven't heard discussed here with you is that when you put money into people's hands, the money doesn't disappear. Like, if I gave you $1,000 a month, it probably would not make a big difference in the economy because it would just go into your account somewhere and, nothing would happen. But we all know that right now, most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 57% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. So you put $1,000 a month into their hands, it's going to go right back into the economy. They're going to spend it on food, childcare, car repairs they've been putting off, the occasional night out. And then all of those businesses end up hiring more people, and then we end up getting some of the money back as tax revenues. So
this is a classic Keynesian fallacy. Yang thinks that simply by giving more money to people who are likely to spend it, the economy will grow. But this ignores the fact that money is only a medium of exchange. In the words of Thomas Sowell, for a society as a whole, money is just an artificial device to get real things done. Otherwise, the government could make us all rich by simply printing more money. It is not money, but the volume of goods and services which determines whether a country is poverty-stricken or prosperous. Allow me to explain. Let's suppose that 4 young adults are currently sharing a 2-bedroom apartment that they rent for $1,000 a month. Each friend submits $250 of their individual income in order to cover the rent. Each of these young adults would like to have their own apartment, but until such time as they get higher paying jobs, it doesn't make sense to spend $1,000 of their own income just so they can have their own apartment. They'd rather share a smaller space, using the saved income to improve their lives in other ways. However, Andrew Yang's plan is enacted, and now every adult receives an additional $1,000 a month. The 4 friends are excited. Now it makes perfect sense for each of them to rent their own apartment and have more space, since they now each have $1,000 more than they did before. However, they haven't considered the repercussions of this. When they go to the landlord to apply for the new apartments, they discovered that the rent has just been raised from $1,000 a month to $2,000 a month, and may possibly rise again. Why? Because even though there is now a $1,000 UBI, there is still the same number of apartments available for rent as there was before the UBI. Now that the landlord has at least 4 times as many tenants seeking their own individual apartment, he'll have no choice but to raise the price to determine who wants the apartments the most. No matter what the government does to try and artificially increase demand by moving money around, supply and demand eventually wins out. This same principle won't just affect the prices of rent, but the prices of any good or service that has increased demand once low-income individuals start receiving a UBI. At this point, someone might object and say that the increase in prices would mean that producers would have a greater incentive to build more apartments, or manufacture more goods and services. This may be true, but you have to remember that the implementation of a UBI didn't actually change the amounts of goods and services in the economy. Therefore, if more apartments are to be built, that means that resources would have to be shifted from other sectors in the economy, which means that costs in other sectors would rise as well. The bottom line is that no amount of government force moving money around can actually make an economy wealthier. Only lowering the costs of creating goods and services, and thus the prices of those goods and services, can actually make an economy wealthier. But this requires innovation, which requires investment. Investors typically come from higher income individuals and businesses who have less to lose should the investment not pan out. But since it is these people and businesses who have had to bear the burden of increased taxes in order to fund the UBI, they are less likely to invest. Do you see the problem? These basic chains of cause and effect demonstrate unequivocally that the best thing the government can do to make its people wealthier is stop trying to make its people wealthier.
Of the 1.8 trillion, we're going to get back, let's call it 400 billion in new tax receipts because everyone's going to be spending more money. We're going to save 1 to 200 billion on things like incarceration and homelessness services and emergency room healthcare. I was in New Hampshire last month, and a prison guard said to me, this is a prison guard, he said we should pay people to stay out of jail because we waste so much money when they're in jail. Like, he sees all the waste in the system. So if you imagine a society where everyone's getting $1,000 a month, that's like it's a great incentive to try and stay out of jail because, you stop getting it if you wind up in jail. And it reduces recidivism because when you come out of jail, at least you have, $1,000 a month waiting for you, and then you're less inclined to commit a crime and head back in.
Okay, there are a few things here. As I just explained, raising demand by redistributing cash doesn't actually increase the amount of goods and services available in the economy, so I'm not convinced that Yang's UBI is going to eliminate the need for homeless or medical services. As for wasting money on prisons, how about we just stop sending people to prison for victimless crimes? I haven't personally reviewed any studies about whether or not a UBI would lead to a lower crime rate or incarceration rate, but this isn't a point I believe is worth arguing about anyways. According to Pew Research data, at most, maybe 1% of the American population is behind bars at any given time, and that's rounding up. So whatever costs may be saved in this sector are highly unlikely to outweigh the costs to the nation as a whole. And what if we change the policy so that we only give a UBI to former prison inmates? In other words, pay them to stay out of prison. I doubt this would make going to prison less attractive.
How much crime do you think you'd actually prevent, though, by giving people $1,000 a month? I mean, I think most of the people that are doing crime, whether it's thievery or assault, they're not thinking this out. This is just either a way of life for them, either they've got real mental issues or a pattern of behavior that they can't break. I really don't think that $1,000 a month is going to fix any of that.
Well, it's not going to fix all of it for sure. I mean, we'll still have jails. It's not like, silver bullet.
Yeah.
But at the margins, would it keep like that person who's falling through the cracks and feels like they have no place in society? And maybe they, it's like the people around them are also like, hey, you don't have any value, and you get $1,000 a month. Maybe like it keeps them off at the margins. And everything we're talking about is at the margins. I mean, everything's like this statistical curve, and you're taking the people who are, let's call it like the last 10 to 20%. But if you reduce our incarcerated population by 10 to 20%, I mean, that's billions and billions of dollars.
Can you get more specific, Mr. Yang? You said we need $1.8 trillion, so if by billions and billions you mean 10 billion or even 50 billion, that still doesn't even get us close. And remember, Hauser's law still dictates that no matter what taxes you propose, you won't successfully collect more than 20% of GDP.
So you're saving money on a bunch of things we spend like about $1 trillion on right now, like healthcare, incarceration, homelessness services. And then the magic is that if you have $1,000 a month and you're a parent, so you feel this, that studies have shown that your kids are healthier, better nourished, more likely to graduate from high school and get further education, mental health improves, relationships improve, domestic violence goes down, hospital visits go down, and your worker productivity goes up.
I was interested to see what studies Mr. Yang was referring to, so I headed over to his website, yang2020.com. Looking through the section on the benefits of UBI, I found 2 studies that actually have provided links. The first comes from the Roosevelt Institute and argues that a UBI would grow the economy, creating more jobs. Reading through the executive summary, the authors of this study immediately acknowledged that they utilized a Keynesian economic model, and that UBI would grow the federal debt. The second was an article published in Science magazine that argues that there is correlation between poverty and decreased cognitive function. While I don't claim I can definitively refute these studies in the course of this video, 2 things strike me immediately. As I've already explained, Keynesian economic policies do in fact increase demand, but they don't actually increase the amount of goods and services in the economy, which means that whatever economic growth they lead to in the short term, supply and demand will take effect and the market will correct itself right back to where it was, leaving no one better off than before. As to the point of the second study, it may well be the case that poor people have lower cognitive function. But this fact, even if a fact, doesn't prove that a UBI will decrease poverty.
I mean, you're an entrepreneur and CEO, so when you run a company, you say, I'm going to invest in my people. I'm going to treat them well and try and train them and give them resources because that'll increase your productivity as an organization. In the public sector, we have the opposite approach. Where if I can just avoid spending money on you, then I'm going to somehow save money. When we end up spending that money in very, very dark, costly, counterproductive ways in the back end, because they wind up, in our institutions, and our institutions just spend a truckload of money.
The problem is that in the public sector, there is no incentive to spend money efficiently, since government can always demand more money from the American taxpayer, whether the taxpayer is happy with those services or not. Private companies can actually evaluate whether the salaries they are paying their employees are effective based on profit or loss margins. Since there is no such measure for government agencies, there is much more bureaucracy and red tape for deciding who gets paid what, and do we actually need more or less employees, and other such decisions. No amount of government intervention can fix this without the profit and loss indicators that stem from free markets and voluntary transactions.
So if you look at the cost savings and the value gains and the economic growth, that actually gets you back about $1 trillion of the 1.8. This is like the trickle-up economy because none of the money disappears. It goes right back into the economy. And the way you get the last $800 billion or so is related to what we think is happening with AI and all these advanced technologies. Because if you look at who's going to win with AI and self-driving cars and trucks, The savings from robot trucks are estimated to be $168 billion a year, just from that one thing. So the problem is that the American public is going to see very little of that money because the winners are going to be the trillion-dollar tech companies that are great at just not paying a lot of taxes. They'll move it through Ireland. Amazon will say, didn't make any money this quarter, no reason to pay taxes. And so what we need to do is we need to put in a new tax that actually gets the American public a slice of every robot truck mile, Amazon transaction, Facebook ad. And every other industrialized country already has this tax. It's called a value-added tax. And because our economy is so vast at 20 trillion, a value-added tax at even half the European level generates about 800 billion in new revenue. And that gets you all the way there. So this is much more achievable and affordable than most people think when they start unpacking how the numbers work out.
And Yang's final point, the value-added tax or VAT. There's a lot to say about this, but let me summarize the main points. A VAT is essentially a very complex sales tax. When you have a VAT, every time money changes hands, a certain percentage, say 10%, is charged in addition and given to the government. Not just when consumers buy the final product, but also when raw materials are sold, when they are sold after they are processed, when products are bought in bulk by retail stores, and finally again when they are bought by the consumer. Would this be more fair or effective than a personal income tax? Some might argue so, but there's no denying that it increases the cost of doing business, both in that businesses incur costs from the VAT, but also in the costs associated with record keeping and collection that must be handled with far greater care than before. Further, if corporations work really hard to find ways of getting out of paying taxes now, do you think that will change if there's a VAT? In 1972, Murray Rothbard wrote, "In the VAT, every firm sends its invoices to the federal government and gets credit for the VAT embodied in its invoices for the goods bought from other firms. The result is an irresistible opening for cheating, and in Western Europe there are special firms whose business is to write out fake invoices which can reduce the tax liabilities of their customer. Those businesses more willing to cheat will then be favored in the competitive struggle of the market." The bottom line is, people don't like having their money taken, so it stands to reason that no matter how the government seeks to increase its tax revenue, it will inevitably lead to less productivity by entrepreneurs or increased efforts to get out of paying taxes. For this reason, I'm not impressed by Yang citing the VAT as a better way to increase tax revenue. Hauser's law still dictates that no matter what, the government will never be able to collect more than 20% of GDP, which means economic growth is what's most important if the government wants to collect more revenue. Well, this one ended up being a bit lengthy, but I hope you found it informative. Like most statists, Andrew Yang has realized he can buy votes by promising people free stuff. But the fact remains that nothing in life comes free. Someone pays, and whether it happens tomorrow or 10 years from now, the US is going to pay the price for its out-of-control spending. What do you guys think about Andrew Yang and his policies? Be sure to comment below, and as always, be sure to like and subscribe. And that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new uploads. And if you're a fan of my channel, please consider supporting me on Subscribestar, Bitbacker, or Patreon. For as low as $1 a month, you'll receive access to patron-exclusive videos, earn the right to participate in patrons-only live streams, join my patrons group chat on Twitter and Discord, and numerous other rewards. Also, be sure to subscribe to my gaming channel for a chance to hang out and chat during gaming streams. Uploads are every Thursday and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.